the colors. Or maybe I'm just noticing them more. And so that's a real blessing, and we're glad to be with you. We do have some memories of your church. When I was pastor at Calvary Baptist Church in Charlotte, we would also compete against your church in Awana Bible quizzing. And I can still hear Brian Jenkins' voice, and first place, Byron Baptist Church. And he would say it, when we won, he never said it quite with the same enthusiasm. I don't know what it was. Maybe it was just the word Byron Baptist made him really excited. So I don't know, but I remember you even had a couple of Bible quizzes you can hear in this church. And so that's where we remember this church. But we're glad to be with you. If you would, please take your Bibles and turn to Psalm chapter 3. Psalm chapter 3. And I titled this message, Where Do I Turn? Many years ago, it was many years ago, I was in high school, so it had to have been many, many years ago. And I went to Highland Park High School, which is probably, some of you may know where Highland Park is. It's in the middle of Detroit, 6 Mile and Woodward area. And I went to Highland Park High School. And on my way home one day, I was surrounded by a whole bunch of individuals that were not wanting to treat me nicely. We call it being jumped, is what we used to call it. And so there I was, kind of surrounded by all these people. And I didn't know what to do. I didn't know where to turn. And so I ran, which would have been the natural thing to do. But as I ran, the first place I went into was an apartment building. And they're chasing me in this apartment building, and I'm running up the steps. But you realize what happens eventually. You run out of steps. And there I was at the landing, and they just pummeled me until somebody at the door said, "What's happening?" And they called the police. But, I ran, and I ended up in a dead end. And I think that's what happens to people today. When we face trials, when we face situations, when we face problems, we really don't know where to turn. And oftentimes, we end up in a dead end. And that's why I really have compassion, especially on lost people. Where do they turn when life turns bad? Where do they turn when sickness occurs? Where do they turn when financial reversal occurs? But even we as Christians, if you're a Christian this morning, where do you turn? Where do you turn when life kind of gives you a curveball and it just seems like everything starts to fall apart? Well, that's what Psalm 3 is all about. Psalm 3 is written by David after he has lost his kingdom. Now, it's one thing to have a revolt in the kingdom and it be another, a person outside of your family. But David is fleeing from his own son Absalom. And Absalom is out to get his dad, and his dad is fleeing, and David turns to the only place he can go. He turns to God. And you and I, when life serves up something that's very unpleasant, when life serves up something that's very difficult, where do you and I turn? So let's look at this in Psalm chapter 3. And we're going to look, first of all, at verses 1 and 2. And it says this, "Lord, how are they increased that trouble me? Many are they who rise up against me. Many are they who say of me, there is no help for him in God." As we look at these first two verses, we see the necessity of turning to God. God sometimes brings things in your life, in my life, that causes us to actually fulfill the song, "Turn your eyes upon Jesus and look full in his wonderful face." Because so often we get so busy in life that we forget to turn our eyes upon Jesus. And I believe that this probably happened with David because, there were times in David's life when he wasn't walking with God. Remember Bathsheba. And remember the whole situation with Absalom and all of that. And so David is in this situation. He's fleeing from his son, and really, it seems hopeless. Have you ever felt hopeless? Have you ever felt helpless? Well, that's where David was. And so, notice his situation that causes him to turn to God. First of all, he's facing persecution. I mean, it says here, Lord, how are they increased who trouble me? Look at these people. They've increased. It's not just like one person is troubling me. Because remember, many of David's counselors, his trusted friends, sided with Absalom. And so here is David, and he's been betrayed by his own son. You know, often the worst hurts that happen in our lives occur from the very people that are close to us. It can be a family member. It can be a church member. It can be a close friend. Those are devastating, aren't they? You know, a stranger says something unkind to you. That's one thing, isn't it? But when it's a trusted friend, when it's a close family member, that's totally another thing. And David here feels the persecution. You know, I think of other people that face that kind of persecution. You just think of, remember, of course, Joseph. Who betrayed Joseph? His very brothers. Who really deceived Isaac, his own son, Jacob? And I could go on and on in cases in the Bible where people have been hurt by those who are closest to them. And so David here is facing persecution. And who knows, maybe the way things are going in our country, we as believers may face persecution down the road, or even now there's more persecution of Christians. You know, I almost feel like in the United States of America, feel like Adolf Hitler did in Germany. He felt like if he could get rid of the Jews, that would solve all his problems. And sometimes I feel like that people in the United States of America feel like if they could get rid of Christians, that would solve all the issues. And that's sad. But that's where we are. And so you and I may face persecution within our family. We may face persecution within our community. We may face persecution within our nation in the future. So we need somewhere to turn. But not only did he face persecution, but his life has changed. You know, change is very difficult. Like right now, your church is without a pastor. That means you are facing a change. You are facing something where everything was kind of normal, and every week you know your pastor would be here unless he was on vacation, and you continued on together as a church, as a family. And now you're in a situation where you're facing change. Who is going to be our pastor? What's going to happen? And David faced a very undesirable change. I mean, here is David, who was king, God's king, and his son rebels against him, and no longer is he in Jerusalem. No longer is he where the tabernacle is, where there's the worship of God. No longer is he recognized as king. His son has rebelled against him. You know, we all face change. Now, some change is nice. I remember before I was single, and now I'm married. Many years ago we got married. But that was a desirable change. Of course, when we had our 3 children, that's desirable change. But sometimes we face changes that are very undesirable. You as individuals may be facing a change that you really weren't looking forward to. A change that is undesirable. I think of Ruth. Remember her change that was undesirable? She lost her husband, and then she left her land, her family, to a land she didn't know. That was some undesirable change. You know, I think of Daniel. There he was as a young man living in Jerusalem. And then, of course, he was taken captive, and he ended up in Babylon. That was undesirable change. And that's what David's facing here. He's facing persecution. He's facing undesirable change. And then notice what he says in verse 2. Many are they who say of me, there is no help for him in God. In other words, he is discouraged. The word discouraged has the idea of the heart taken out of a person. Encouragement is putting the heart in a person. Well, David's heart is now very discouraged. It's like he looks at himself and he's in despair, which means without hope. He's discouraged, he's without hope. And then, notice, not only is he feeling discouraged, but there's people all around him discouraging him. Notice, many are they who say of me, there's no help for him in God. In other words, nobody is really encouraging him. Even though he may have some friends with him, they're discouraging him. Remember, as he was fleeing from Jerusalem, there was a man by the name of Shimei. And he said, come out, you bloody man, you man of Belial. Notice, the crowds were mocking him, making fun of him. He was discouraged because other people would say, it's not going to happen. I'm sure we've all experienced that, right? When somebody has said something to us and they said, there's no help in God. Where's God in this? And so that's where David was. People were discouraging him. And you know, not only do people discourage us, but who is called the accuser of the brethren? Satan. He discourages us. And not only do people discourage us, not only does Satan discourage us, but you know who discourages ourselves the most? We ourselves. Remember in Psalm 42 it says this, why art thou cast down, O my soul? Why art thou disquieted in me? Hope thou in God, for I shall yet praise him for his countenance. He says, why are you cast down? In other words, he's talking to himself. He's talking to his soul. And he's saying, soul, what are you doing? Why are you discouraged? Why are you disheartened? Why are you feeling hopeless? I'm sure all of us in this room have felt hopeless. We have felt discouraged. We have felt the future is very, very vague and very fearful. So David needs somewhere to turn to. He's persecuted. His life is facing an undesirable change. He's discouraged. But I'm glad the psalm doesn't end there, aren't you? Because notice there's a big word in verse 3. But, in other words, yes, all this is happening in my life. All of these terrible circumstances. I may be facing death. But you, O Lord, are a shield for me, my glory and the one who lifts up my head. Notice, David understands something that you and I need to understand. When life is falling apart, we can say, but you. Why can you and I turn to God? What is it about God that should encourage us to turn to him? Notice, first of all, he says, but you, O Lord. Notice he recognizes him as Lord. He recognizes the fact that God is in control. Tothing enters into our life that doesn't first pass through the hands of a loving God. Nothing. Whatever you're facing today, remember that God is in control. I know it's hard sometimes. It seems like sometimes things are falling apart. But don't you think, remember with Paul, remember when he was beaten and then he was cast into jail at Philippi? You and I would probably think, where is God? But Paul knew that God was in control. And what did he and Silas do? He sang to God. Let's not forget. I know we have all the things about the politics and all of that and elections, and sometimes elections go the way maybe you would like them to go. Sometimes they don't go the way you would like them to go. But let's not forget that God is in control. Even though David was fleeing for his life, he said, "But you, O Lord, you are the master. You are sovereign. You are in control." And notice something else that he's reminded of. He says, "But you, O Lord, are a shield for me." Now that word shield is, sometimes you see the Roman soldiers with, sword fighting. I'm sorry, I'm left-handed, so I do the opposite. And they have the little round shield that, in the movies. And they have the sword. That's not the kind of shield. It's kind of like if you've ever seen in the movies or in a documentary when there is an attack of arrows, bow and arrows on an army. And they have these long shields and they're hiding under the whole shield. That's what he's talking about, that kind of shield. In other words, God protects us. He protects us from the outside. He protects us in the inside. He protects us. Now, it didn't look like God was protecting David at this moment. But he turns to God realizing that God alone is our protector. He is sovereign. He is our shield. And then notice something else he says. He is my glory. In other words, he sees the purpose of all this. Ultimately, God does all things for his glory. In a few moments, we're going to be taking of the Lord's Supper. And as we partake of the bread, we're reminded that Jesus is the bread of life. And he says, "This is my body, but is broken for you." And then, of course, "This is my blood that was shed for you." And of course, these are symbols of that. What is Jesus saying here? My death, when he was speaking to the disciples, is for the glory of God. See, ultimately, everything that occurs in our life, and everything we do, whatever you do in word or deed, do all for what? The glory of God. I don't know, David probably saw that somehow, some way, this situation that seems so awful, so wicked, would be used for the glory of God. And so we see David's situation. That's why he needs to turn to God. We see God and who he is, and this is the reason why we are turning to God. He is sovereign. He is our shield, our protector. He has a plan. It's for his glory. And then I just love this last part of verse number 3. "And the one who lifts up my head." That is such a beautiful picture. You know why? It's a picture. Haven't you ever, those of you that have had children, or maybe, well, all of us have been children. Remember in a time in your life when everything seems to be, some little thing nowadays, maybe your cat died, or maybe your pet worm died, or whatever, and, whatever. And you're sad. You've seen children when they're sad. They look like this. And what do you do as an adult? If you see your child that way, you get down on their level, and you lift up their head, and you look at them eye to eye, and you say, "What? It's going to be all right. Daddy loves you, or Mommy loves you. It's going to be all right." And that's what God is doing with David. He says, "You are the lifter up of my head." Yes, I've been discouraged. Yes, I've been betrayed. Yes, my life is changing before my eyes. But it's all right because God lifts up our head and he looks us face to face. And it says it's going to be all right. That's why you and I can turn to him. He has that compassion to lift up our heads and to take us and look at us eye to eye and say that I care. And so David sees the necessity of turning to God. He sees the encouragement to turn to God in verse number 3. But then in verse 4, we see how he turns to God. How do we turn to God? You know, notice what it says here. I cried to the Lord with my voice, and he heard me out of his holy hill. Notice he's crying out to God. He's pleading with God. He's crying out to God. God, help me. Take care of me. You see where I am. You see my son has betrayed me. You see that I'm no longer in Jerusalem as king. I'm discouraged. I cry out to you. Psalm 34 says, this poor man cried, and the Lord heard him. You see, when you walk the streets of New York City, the people that are wearing the suits, the people that are making the money in the office buildings, they don't cry out. But when you're walking through New York City, the beggars are crying out. You and I oftentimes need to see that we are beggars, that we need to cry out to God. We are not self-sufficient. Without him, it says, we can do nothing. Paul said, I can do all things through Christ which strengthens me. You see, David's a beggar now. He's no longer a king. He's a beggar. And he cries out to God. You see that again, like I said in Psalm 34. This poor man cried, and the Lord heard him. I sought the Lord, and he heard me and delivered me from all my fears. And so David cries out to God. When was the last time you've cried out to God? You know, there are times when you and I want to cry out to God. I remember a couple of years ago, it's easy to remember because I came down with COVID. Actually, we were visiting a church. The pastor collapsed at the end of the sermon, and he would die a week later from COVID. That's where I got it that same Sunday. But I ended up in the hospital after 10 days. I struggled with it. And I could hardly breathe. And so I remember waiting for the, like, were my lungs damaged or whatever. And they shipped me off to Sparrow. And I was there for 6 or 7 days. And I remember it was miserable. And really all I could do was cry out to God. I couldn't read the Bible. My mind was so messed up. Whenever I had to walk to the bathroom, it was a struggle to walk from here to where my wife is. It was like walking 5 miles. There are times when we know that the only thing we can do is to cry out to God. And that's what David does here. See, when you have nowhere to turn, realize that there's one who wants to hear your cry. There's one who wants to hear what you have to say. There's one that says, come unto me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. You know, if you look at the book of Psalms, why do you and I relate to the book of Psalms? We do so because we see often the psalmist crying out to God. And that's what David does. You know, he could have been plotting and planning and shaking his hands and saying, I don't know what to do. But he cried out to God because he knew that God alone is sovereign. He knew that God alone is his protector. He knew that God alone is his help. And he knew that God alone is the one that lifts up his head. So notice what happens after he cries out to God. It is such a beautiful picture. Notice what happens. I lay down and slept. I awoke, for the Lord sustained me. I will not be afraid of 10,000s of people who have set themselves against me all around. Notice, David cries out to God. And the first comfort came in verse 4. What is the comfort of turning to God? He says here, and he heard me from his holy hill. Isn't it comforting to know that someone hears you? Isn't it comforting to know that no matter how weak your cry is, God hears you? You know, I remember when I was in that hospital room, of course, my wife couldn't be with me. My son came up from Texas to be with her. You know, I mean, I could talk to her on the phone, but that was about it. And very rarely would there be a nurse coming, because they're busy. They were overloaded, of course. There's nobody to listen to. Nobody listened to my cry. But God was there. God listened. God will listen to your cry. There's a comfort in that, isn't there? That's what I feel for people that are without Christ. When they cry out, they have no answer unless they're crying out directly to God and repenting of their sin. We can cry out, and he hears us. But not only that, but notice the peace that he's experienced. I mean, here in the midst of all the persecution, the hatred of his son, the changes in life, he says, I lay down and slept. I awoke, for the Lord sustained me. There is comfort in his peace. There's comfort in the fact that he hears us. But there's comfort. Notice the peace. I laid me down and slept. Why do you and I have difficulty sleeping? Occasionally it's because we have physical pain. But usually we have trouble sleeping because we're lacking peace. We're filled with anxiety. We're filled with worry. And so we don't sleep. And obviously we can take pills to do that occasionally, but where does a lack of sleep come from? It usually comes from worry. It comes from anxiety, a lack of peace. If there was ever an occasion where David could not sleep, I would say this is it. And yet he says, I laid me down and slept. You know why? Because he cried out to God. And he was comforted by the fact that God heard him. He was comforted by the fact that God is his peace. And then notice in verse number 6, I will not be afraid of 10,000s of people who have set themselves against me all around. Notice his courage is back up. You know, he was discouraged in verse 2. There's people that say there is no help for me in God. But now he has cried out to God. And there is that courage. I will not be afraid of 10,000s of people that have set themselves against me round about. That's what you and I are going to have to do in our lives. When you and I are feeling like everything is falling apart, we just can't face another day. We just can't face another person. We just can't face the situation that we're in. God says, yes, I will give you courage. David had courage to face the next day. David had courage to face the day after that. Not because he found it within himself. He found the courage in God. You know, when God told Joshua to be strong and courageous, remember, that strength and courage came from God, not from within Joshua. And so you and I, when we cry out to God, there is comfort in that. There's comfort that we need because he does hear us. He does give us peace. He does give us courage to face the days, the courage to face tomorrow and the day after that. And then verses 7 and 8 seem like the complete reversal of verses 1 and 2. We see the testimony. What kind of testimony do you and I have? You know, I believe that you probably have heard the saying, the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. You know, those martyrs for the faith, and there's still martyrs today around the world. You go to Nigeria, there are martyrs in Nigeria. There are martyrs in China. There are martyrs in the Middle East. In a sense, sometimes there's martyrs here in the States. They may not lose their life, but they are persecuted. But when we think about martyrs, they have a testimony. You know, I love to do missionary biographies. Like when I was pastor, every Sunday night I would do a missionary biography. You know, I would do some of those children's biographies. You know, and we go through, you know, the biography of Hudson Taylor or the biography of John Payton and whoever else. And it's exciting. Why do we like those biographies? Because we see the trials that these missionaries face, and yet they cry out to God, and they have a testimony. See, a testimony is not built in the sunshine. A testimony is built in the storms of life. You know, that's what happens. That's why you and I love to read, I hope you do, love to read biographies of Christians, because they usually have great tribulation. One of the missionary biographies that Sharon and I listened to was Jack DeShazer. And here was a man who was one of the Doolittle Raiders. You know, he was one of the ones that dropped the bombs on Tokyo in 42. And he was captured by the Japanese. And for 2.5 years, he was under Japanese captivity. He was angry at them. He was bitter at them. But finally, somehow, he got a Bible. And as he read that Bible, he became a Christian. And then, after the war, guess where he decided and thought that God wanted him to be a missionary? He wanted him to be a missionary to Japan. Do you think those people didn't respect his testimony? Not being bitter, but loving the people there? You know, just as a aside to that, the man who led the attack on Pearl Harbor read his tract and became a Christian. Isn't that amazing? The prisoner and the person that attacked Pearl Harbor would do meetings together in Japan. That's a testimony. A testimony comes in the hard times. Testimony comes when we cry out to God. And notice his testimony in verses 7 and 8. Arise, O Lord, save me, O my God, for you have struck all my enemies on the cheekbone. You have broken the teeth of the ungodly. Notice his enemies are defeated. Now, when he wrote this, they weren't defeated yet, but he saw that God is in control and they might as well be defeated. You know, we are on the winning side. You know, when you read the book of Revelation, God is not the loser. Satan is. When you read the book of Revelation, we know that Jesus is king and he will reign forever and ever and ever. He is the King of kings and the Lord of lords. And so we see David's testimony. He's confident now. He's confident in victory in Jesus. And then he says, salvation belongs to the Lord. That is salvation. In other words, he believes in the victory that's been gotten. The enemies have been defeated. And he now knows that God has delivered him. You know, I like that word salvation, isn't it? Salvation belongs to the Lord. We'll be partaking of the Lord's Supper. What is that a reminder of? Salvation belongs to God. We would be hopeless if Jesus Christ had not died for us. And then he says lastly, your blessing is upon your people. It seemed like the first two verses were all curses. But the last two verses, blessing, testimony. So don't look at those situations in your life, maybe betrayals, maybe a change of life that's difficult. Maybe you're discouraged and disheartened. God is there. He is in control. He is sovereign. He will give you his peace. He will lift up your head. And he will give you a testimony. He will give you that testimony you know, there's a cost to letting that light shine. We see the cost in verses 1 and 2. But we see the cry in verse number 3, 4. And then we see the blessing, the peace, the victory, the testimony. And that's what God wants for you and for me. That's why Jesus died on the cross, yes, to save us for all eternity, but also to enjoy him while we're here on this earth. You need to cry out to him today. Do you have confidence to cry out to him? Do you really believe that he will hear you? Will you let him lift up your head and look you eye in eye and say, it will be all right. I will take care of you. Be not dismayed, whatever betide. I will take care of you, my child. And he will. Our dear Father, we thank you for your word this morning. We thank you for the example of David. Oh, we saw the struggles in verses 1 and 2, and I can't imagine what was going on in David's heart. But we're so thankful for those words, but God. And how he turned to you, and he cried out to you, and you gave him that answer. You gave him your peace. You gave him courage to face the next day, the next days ahead of him. You gave him confidence. And he's a testimony to us today. You used David to speak to our hearts today. And we're so thankful for that. In Jesus' most precious name.